The marble floors of the Henderson mansion gleamed under crystal chandeliers, but nothing could shine bright enough to mask the darkness that had settled over this house. In the sprawling estate overlooking San Francisco Bay, where every room cost more than most people's annual salaries, a little girl sat alone at a dining table built for 12, pushing her untouched breakfast around her plate with the mechanical precision of someone who had given up on hope. 8-year-old Isabella Henderson possessed everything money could buy: designer clothes hanging unworn in a walk-in closet, a playroom filled with toys she never touched, and a bedroom that looked like something from a fairy tale magazine. Yet her eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone twice her age, someone who had learned too young that wealth couldn't purchase the one thing she needed most, someone who truly cared. Her father, Marcus Henderson, built his technology empire from nothing, turning a small software startup into a billion-dollar corporation that dominated Silicon Valley. But success had come at a price he was only beginning to understand. Between board meetings in Tokyo and merger negotiations in New York, between congressional hearings about data privacy and investor calls that lasted until midnight, Marcus had somehow lost track of the most important thing in his world. His daughter, the previous nanny, had quit without explanation 3 weeks ago, leaving behind only a formal resignation letter that mentioned fundamental differences in childcare philosophy. Since then, Isabella had been shuttled between housekeepers and Marcus's overwhelmed personal assistant, each person treating her like a delicate piece of expensive furniture that needed to be kept safe, but not necessarily loved. This morning would change everything, though neither Marcus nor Isabella knew it yet. In exactly 47 minutes, a yellow taxi would pull up to the Henderson estate's imposing iron gates, carrying a woman whose arrival would transform their lives in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cynthia Martinez stepped out of the taxi, her worn leather messenger bag slung over her shoulder and her grandmother's silver cross catching the morning sunlight. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced life's hardships head-on and emerged stronger. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her simple blue dress, professional but not expensive, spoke. To someone who understood the difference between looking the part and being authentic, the Henderson estate loomed before her like something from a movie set. Perfectly manicured lawns stretched in every direction, punctuated by fountains and topiary gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most people earned in a year. The house itself was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that seemed designed to showcase wealth rather than create warmth. Cynthia had seen luxury before during her 8 years as a professional nanny, but nothing quite like this. She'd worked for tech executives in Palo Alto, entertainment lawyers in Los Angeles, and even a former ambassador in Washington, D.C. Each family had their own dynamics, their own challenges, but they all shared one thing in common: parents who had somehow convinced themselves that providing financial security was the same thing as providing love. The massive front door opened before she could ring the bell, revealing a stern-looking woman in her 50s, wearing a crisp black suit that screamed efficiency over warmth. Ms. Martinez, I presume. The woman's voice carried a slight accent that suggested European boarding schools and expensive finishing programs. I'm Patricia Whitmore, Mr. Henderson's chief of staff. He's unfortunately been detained by an urgent call with our Singapore office, but he asked me to handle the orientation. Cynthia smiled warmly, extending her hand. Please call me Cynthia. I'm looking forward to meeting Isabella. Patricia's handshake was firm but brief, and Cynthia noticed how the woman's eyes seemed to catalogue everything about her appearance in those first few seconds. Yes, well, Isabella is currently having her breakfast. Before we proceed, I should review the household expectations and protocols with you. As they walked through the foyer, Cynthia's trained eye took in details that most people would miss. The house was immaculate, but it felt more like a high-end hotel than a family home. There were no family photos on the walls, no children's artwork stuck to the refrigerator, no signs that a little girl actually lived here. Instead, she saw expensive artwork, fresh flower arrangements that looked professionally done, and furniture that seemed chosen more for its aesthetic value than its comfort. Isabella follows a very structured schedule, Patricia continued, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what looked like a military-grade itinerary. Breakfast at 7:30, educational activities from 9 to 11, lunch at precisely noon, quiet time until 2, afternoon enrichment activities, dinner at 6, and bedtime preparation, beginning at 7:30. Mr. Henderson believes consistency is crucial for optimal child development. Cynthia nodded politely, but inside she felt a familiar sadness. She'd seen this before. Parents who treated their children's lives like corporate projects, complete with metrics and optimization strategies. What does Isabella enjoy doing in her free time? Patricia looked momentarily confused by the question. Free time? Well, her schedule is quite comprehensive. Piano lessons on Mondays and Thursdays, Mandarin tutoring on Tuesdays and Fridays, swimming lessons on Wednesdays, and art instruction on weekends. Mr. Henderson wants to ensure she's prepared for competitive academic environments. Of course, Cynthia said carefully. But what makes her laugh? What does she choose to do when she can pick anything? Before Patricia could respond, they entered the dining room, and Cynthia saw Isabella for the first time. The little girl sat at the far end of an enormous mahogany table, dwarfed by the formal dining chairs and elaborate place setting. She wore a pristine white school uniform with every button perfectly aligned, her dark hair pulled back in tight braids that looked almost painful. But it was her posture that broke Cynthia's heart. Shoulders slightly hunched, head down, the universal body language of someone trying to make themselves invisible. "Isabella," Patricia announced, in a tone one might use to address a business meeting. "This is Ms. Martinez, your new nanny." The little girl looked up briefly, and Cynthia saw eyes that seemed far too old for her 8-year-old face. Isabella gave a small, polite nod, clearly a practiced response, before returning her attention to her untouched eggs Benedict. Cynthia approached slowly, reading the child's body language like a book, written in a language she'd become fluent in over the years. Instead of the cheerful, overwhelming introduction that many adults inflicted on children, she simply pulled out the chair next to Isabella and sat down. "That's a beautiful necklace," Cynthia said quietly, noticing a small silver pendant that looked different from the rest of Isabella's carefully curated appearance. "It looks special." Isabella's hand moved instinctively to touch the necklace, and for the first time her expression softened slightly. "It was my mom's," she whispered so quietly that Patricia, who was busying herself with scheduling details at the other end of the table, couldn't hear. Cynthia felt her heart constrict. In all her research about the Henderson family, she'd learned that Marcus's wife, Elena, had died in a car accident 3 years ago. What she hadn't known was that Isabella still carried this tangible connection to her mother. "She must have had wonderful taste," Cynthia said simply, "and I bet she had the most beautiful daughter." For just a moment, Isabella's carefully constructed mask slipped, and Cynthia saw a glimpse of the little girl underneath, vulnerable, lonely, and desperately in need of someone who saw her as more than a responsibility to be managed. Patricia cleared her throat, clearly eager to move things along. "Isabella needs to leave for school in exactly 22 minutes. The driver will take her to Marin Academy, where she's enrolled in their accelerated program. Pickup is at 3:15 sharp." Cynthia nodded but kept her attention on Isabella. "What's your favorite subject at school?" Isabella shrugged, a movement so small it was barely perceptible. "I don't know. Math, I guess. It's easier when there's only one right answer." The comment hit Cynthia like a punch to the stomach. She'd heard similar sentiments from other children in high-pressure households, but coming from someone so young, it revealed a worldview that no 8-year-old should have to carry. Math is pretty cool, Cynthia agreed. But you know what I always loved about school? The unexpected parts. Like when you're studying one thing and suddenly discover something completely different that makes you excited. Isabella looked up again, this time with something that might have been curiosity flickering in her dark eyes. That happens. Before Cynthia could answer, Patricia intervened with military precision. Isabella, you need to finish your breakfast and gather your school materials. Your father specifically requested that we maintain adherence to the established timeline, as if summoned by the mention of his name. Marcus Henderson strode into the dining room, already dressed in an expensive suit and checking messages on his phone. At 42, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that had probably served him well in boardrooms, but seemed oversized in the context of breakfast with his daughter. "Good morning." "Isabella," he said absently, leaning down to give her a quick kiss on the forehead without really looking at her. His attention was already shifting to Cynthia. "Ms. Martinez, I apologize for the delay. Emergency situation with our European partners. Patricia's briefed you on everything?" Cynthia stood and shook his hand, studying his face as she did. She saw intelligence, determination, and exhaustion, but also something else. When his eyes briefly met Isabella's, there was a flash of something that looked almost like fear. Not fear of his daughter, but fear of failing her in ways he didn't know how to fix. "We've covered the basics," Cynthia replied diplomatically. "I'm looking forward to getting to know Isabella better." Marcus nodded briskly. "Excellent. Patricia has all the contact information, emergency protocols, and Isabella's complete medical history. I'm flying to Seattle this afternoon for investor meetings, back Thursday evening. If anything urgent comes up, Patricia will coordinate." He paused, finally looking directly at his daughter. "Be good for Ms. Martinez, sweetheart. I'll bring you something nice from my trip." Isabella's smile was polite and practiced. "Okay, Daddy, have a good trip." But Cynthia noticed what Marcus missed in his hurry, the way Isabella's shoulders sagged slightly when he mentioned leaving. The practiced resignation in her voice, the way her small hand clutched her mother's necklace as if drawing strength from it. As Marcus disappeared back into his phone conversation, Patricia began the efficient process of getting Isabella ready for school. Backpack checked, lunch prepared by the kitchen staff, uniform inspected for any imperfections. Within minutes, Isabella was walking toward the front door with the mechanical precision of someone following a routine that had been drilled into her hundreds of times. At the door, she turned back to look at Cynthia with an expression that was part hope, part skepticism. "Will you be here when I get back?" The question carried weight far beyond its simple words. Cynthia heard all the unspoken parts, the other nannies who had left, the promises that had been broken, the quiet disappointment of a child who had learned not to expect too much. "I'll be here," Cynthia said firmly. "And when you get home, maybe you can show me your room and tell me about your favorite things." Isabella nodded solemnly, as if filing away this promise to examine later for potential disappointment. Then she was gone, walking toward the black sedan with the same measured steps she'd used at breakfast, leaving Cynthia alone with Patricia and a house that felt far too large for the small life it contained. As the car disappeared down the driveway, Cynthia made a silent promise that went far beyond her professional obligations. This little girl needed more than another caregiver following protocols and maintaining schedules. She needed someone who would see her, really see her, and fight for her happiness with the same intensity that her father fought for business deals. What Cynthia didn't know yet was that Isabella's biggest battles weren't being fought at home, but in the hallways and classrooms of her prestigious private school, where her wealth made her a target and her loneliness made her an easy victim. The discovery that would change everything was still hours away, waiting in a place where surveillance cameras couldn't reach and adult supervision couldn't penetrate. But first, Cynthia had work to do. She had a little girl's world to understand, and she had a feeling that understanding would require looking far beyond the perfect surfaces that surrounded them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After Isabella left for school, Cynthia found herself alone in the Henderson mansion with Patricia, who immediately launched into what felt like a corporate orientation session. They toured the house methodically. Isabella's bedroom, with its untouched toys and perfectly made bed. The playroom that looked more like a showroom than a space where a child actually played. And the home office where Isabella completed her homework under the watchful eye of various tutors. But it was Isabella's bathroom that stopped Cynthia in her tracks. Hidden behind expensive toiletries and folded towels, she discovered something that made her heart sink. A small collection of bandages, antiseptic cream, and what looked like concealer, far too sophisticated for an 8-year-old's typical scraped knees. Isabella occasionally has minor accidents, Patricia explained when she noticed Cynthia's attention. She's quite clumsy, always bumping into things. Mr. Henderson had the pediatrician recommend extra vitamins for coordination. Cynthia nodded but said nothing. In her years of experience, she'd learned to recognize the difference between normal childhood injuries and something more concerning. The placement of these supplies, the way they were hidden rather than displayed, and the sophisticated nature of the concealer suggested something Patricia either didn't see or chose not to acknowledge. The tour continued to Isabella's study area, where Cynthia examined the little girl's schoolwork. Isabella's academic performance was impressive, straight A's across every subject, handwriting that was precise and careful, assignments completed with meticulous attention to detail. But there was something mechanical about it all, as if Isabella approached her education the same way she approached everything else, with careful precision, designed to avoid drawing attention or criticism. She's exceptionally bright, Patricia noted with what sounded like professional pride. Mr. Henderson believes in maximizing her potential through rigorous academic standards. Cynthia picked up one of Isabella's recent book reports, a 5-page analysis of Charlotte's Web that read, more like a college paper than something written by a second grader. The technical proficiency was remarkable, but it lacked any sense of joy or personal connection to the story. It was as if Isabella had learned to perform brilliance rather than experience it. Does she have friends at school? Cynthia asked, continuing to flip through Isabella's work. Patricia paused, and Cynthia caught something flickering across her expression. Uncertainty, maybe even concern. Isabella is quite focused on her studies. Mr. Henderson believes that academic excellence should be the priority at her age. Social development can come later. It was a diplomatic non-answer that told Cynthia everything she needed to know. She'd worked with enough high-achieving families to recognize the code. Isabella was struggling socially, but the family had chosen to frame it as intentional focus rather than address the underlying issues. By noon, Patricia had returned to her own responsibilities, leaving Cynthia with several hours to prepare for Isabella's return. Instead of organizing activities or reviewing schedules, she did something that might have seemed insignificant but was actually revolutionary in the Henderson household. She baked cookies. The kitchen staff looked bewildered when she politely declined their offer to prepare Isabella's afternoon snack according to the nutritionist-approved menu. Instead, Cynthia rolled up her sleeves and began mixing ingredients for simple chocolate chip cookies, the kind that filled a house with warmth and the promise of comfort. As the cookies baked, Cynthia explored Isabella's room more thoroughly. She found photo albums tucked away in a drawer, filled with pictures of Isabella with her mother. Elena Henderson had been beautiful in an understated way, and in every photo, her love for her daughter was unmistakable. They were captured in moments of genuine joy, baking together, reading bedtime stories, playing in the garden that was now maintained by professional landscapers. The contrast was heartbreaking. In the photos taken before Elena's death, Isabella glowed with the confidence of a child who knew she was cherished. Her smile was genuine, her posture relaxed, her eyes bright with curiosity and mischief. The little girl in these pictures bore only a passing resemblance to the careful, guarded child Cynthia had met that morning. The timer chimed, and Cynthia pulled the cookies from the oven just as she heard the front door open. She quickly arranged them on a plate and waited, listening to the familiar sounds of Isabella's return, the quiet greeting to Patricia, the careful placement of her school bag, the measured footsteps on marble floors. When Isabella appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her pristine uniform but with something different in her expression, Cynthia felt her suspicions solidify into certainty. Isabella's carefully braided hair was slightly mussed. There was a small tear in her white knee sock that hadn't been there that morning, and most tellingly, she moved with the cautious gait of someone who was sore. "Hi, sweetie," Cynthia said warmly, as if nothing was amiss. "How was your day?" "I made cookies. Want to try one while they're still warm?" Isabella's eyes widened at the sight of the homemade cookies, but instead of the delight Cynthia expected, she saw something that looked almost like panic. "I'm not supposed to eat sugar between meals. Patricia says it affects my concentration for tutoring sessions." "Well, sometimes rules are meant to be bent a little," Cynthia said gently. "Besides, I won't tell if you won't." For a moment Isabella hesitated, caught between ingrained compliance and the simple desire for something that smelled like home and comfort. Finally, she reached for a cookie with the careful precision she applied to everything else, as if even this small act of rebellion required strategic planning. The first bite seemed to surprise her, and for just a moment her guard dropped completely. "These taste like the ones my mom used to make," she whispered, and Cynthia saw tears threatening in her dark eyes. "Your mom sounds like she was pretty amazing," Cynthia said, settling into a chair across from Isabella. "What else did you two like to do together?" As Isabella began to share memories, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm, Cynthia noticed something important. When talking about her mother, Isabella's whole demeanor changed. Her shoulders relaxed, her voice became animated, and glimpses of the joyful child from the photographs began to emerge. But when Cynthia gently asked about school, the transformation was immediate and devastating. Isabella's shoulders tensed, her voice became careful and measured, and that guarded expression returned to her eyes. "School is fine," Isabella said with practiced neutrality. "I got an A+ on my math test today." "That's wonderful," Cynthia replied. "What about lunch? Did you sit with anyone special?" Isabella's hand moved unconsciously to her side, and Cynthia caught the slight wince that accompanied the movement. "I usually eat by myself. It helps me concentrate on my studies." Another carefully constructed answer that revealed everything while saying nothing. Cynthia had worked with enough children to recognize the signs of social isolation, but this felt different. This felt deliberate, not just exclusion, but something more actively harmful. "Isabella," Cynthia said carefully, "you know you can talk to me about anything, right? Even if it's something that might seem scary or complicated?" Isabella looked up from her cookie, and for a moment Cynthia thought she might open up. But then, as if remembering some invisible script, Isabella's expression became politely distant again. "Everything's fine, Ms. Martinez. Should we start my homework now? I have a book report due tomorrow, and Patricia says punctuality is a sign of respect." The moment of potential connection slipped away, but Cynthia didn't push. She'd learned that trust had to be built slowly, especially with children who had been hurt. Instead, she helped Isabella with her homework, noting how the little girl approached each assignment with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything else. As they worked together, Cynthia began to formulate a plan. Whatever was happening to Isabella at school, it was serious enough to leave physical evidence, and significant enough to change a bright, joyful child into someone who moved through life like she was walking on thin ice. But confronting the situation directly would likely cause Isabella to retreat further into her protective shell. Instead, Cynthia decided to do something that went against every protocol Patricia had outlined. She was going to start picking Isabella up from school herself. Not to spy or investigate, but to be present in the spaces where Isabella felt most vulnerable. Sometimes the most important discoveries happened not through interrogation, but through simply being available when a child finally felt safe enough to reveal the truth. That evening, as Isabella completed her scheduled activities with the same careful compliance she showed everything else, Cynthia made a series of phone calls. She contacted the school to arrange pickup authorization, researched the faculty and administration, and began to understand the social dynamics of Marine Academy's elementary program. What she discovered during those calls would have been alarming to any parent paying attention. Marine Academy prided itself on academic excellence and exclusivity, but their anti-bullying policies were outdated. Their supervision protocols had significant gaps, and their approach to social dynamics seemed to focus more on protecting the school's reputation than protecting individual students. When Marcus called that evening from Seattle, a brief, distracted conversation focused on logistics rather than connection. Cynthia made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to wait for permission or navigate through administrative channels. Tomorrow, she was going to see Isabella's world for herself, and she was going to start building the evidence she suspected she would need to protect a little girl who had learned to protect herself by becoming invisible. As she tucked Isabella into bed that night, Cynthia noticed something that broke her heart all over again. Despite the mansion's perfect climate control, Isabella slept curled in a tight ball, arms wrapped around a small stuffed elephant that looked well-loved and frequently held. It was the posture of someone who had learned to comfort themselves, because comfort from others couldn't be counted on. "Sweet dreams, Isabella," Cynthia whispered, gently adjusting the covers. "Miss Martinez." Isabella's voice was small in the darkness. "Will you really be here tomorrow?" "I'll be here," Cynthia promised. "And I'll be here the day after that, and the day after that." Isabella nodded against her pillow. And for the first time since Cynthia had arrived, she saw something that looked like hope flickering in the little girl's eyes. It was fragile and cautious, but it was there. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would test that hope and challenge everything the Henderson family believed about their carefully constructed world. But tonight, for the first time in months, Isabella Henderson fell asleep, knowing that someone was in her corner, someone who saw her as more than a problem to be managed or a reputation to be maintained, someone who was willing to fight for her. The next morning brought San Francisco's typical fog, rolling in from the bay like a gray blanket that seemed to mirror the atmosphere inside the Henderson mansion. Cynthia arrived at Isabella's bedroom to find the little girl already awake, sitting by her window and staring out at the gardens, with an expression that seemed far too contemplative for someone who should be getting ready for another day of second grade. "Morning, sweetheart," Cynthia said softly, settling beside Isabella on the window seat. "You're up early." Isabella didn't turn away from the window. "I always wake up early." "It's quieter then." The comment carried an undercurrent that made Cynthia's chest tighten. She'd worked with enough traumatized children to recognize the signs, the hypervigilance, the preference for times when the world felt safer and more predictable. But Isabella was 8 years old and living in a mansion with round-the-clock security. What was she trying to stay ahead of? Getting ready for school revealed more pieces of the puzzle. Cynthia watched as Isabella selected her clothes with the precision of someone preparing armor for battle. Every detail was perfect. The uniform pressed to crisp lines, hair braided so tightly it pulled at her scalp, shoes polished to a mirror shine. But it was the way Isabella moved as she dressed that caught Cynthia's attention. She favored her left side slightly, and when she thought Cynthia wasn't looking, she gingerly touched her ribs with the practiced motion of someone checking for tenderness. "Isabella," Cynthia said carefully, "did you hurt yourself yesterday? Maybe during PE or playground time?" The transformation was immediate. Isabella's expression became carefully blank, and when she spoke, her voice carried the rehearsed quality Cynthia was beginning to recognize. "I'm just a little clumsy. Patricia says I need to pay better attention to where I'm walking." Breakfast was a repeat of the previous morning's careful choreography, but today Cynthia noticed details she'd missed before. Isabella ate methodically, but she barely consumed half of what was on her plate. When Patricia mentioned Isabella's upcoming parent-teacher conference, the little girl's fork paused mid-air for just a moment, such a small reaction that most people would have missed it entirely. "The conference is next Tuesday," Patricia informed Cynthia. "Mr. Henderson specifically requested that all academic and behavioral reports be compiled in advance. He likes to review comprehensive data before these meetings." Isabella's reaction to hearing her father described as reviewing behavioral reports was subtle but telling. Her shoulders drew together slightly, and she began cutting her food into smaller and smaller pieces, as if the act of precision could somehow protect her from whatever those reports might contain. After Isabella left for school, Cynthia made a decision that went against every protocol Patricia had outlined. Instead of spending the day familiarizing herself with household routines and Isabella's extensive schedule, she drove to Marine Academy to observe the pickup process from the previous day. The school was exactly what she'd expected. Pristine buildings surrounded by manicured grounds, luxury cars lined up for pickup, and the kind of architectural grandeur that screamed exclusivity. But Cynthia wasn't interested in the facade. She positioned herself in a coffee shop across the street with a clear view of the playground and pickup area. And she waited. What she saw during the lunch recess made her blood run cold. Isabella emerged from the building with the same careful, measured steps she used everywhere else. But here, in this supposedly safe environment, those steps served a different purpose. She was navigating around clusters of other children with the precision of someone avoiding landmines. When a group of 3 girls from her class approached, Isabella's entire body language changed. She became smaller, more defensive, ready to absorb whatever was coming. From across the street, Cynthia couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language perfectly. The 3 girls, all blonde, all wearing designer accessories that probably cost more than most families spent on groceries, surrounded Isabella in a formation that looked casual to adult observers, but was clearly strategic. They took turns speaking, each comment causing Isabella to shrink further into herself. Then came the physical contact. Nothing dramatic enough to attract teacher attention, but a series of accidental bumps, pushes disguised as playful gestures, and what looked like someone stepping hard on Isabella's foot. Isabella never retaliated, never called for help, never even raised her voice. She simply endured it with the same careful compliance she showed at home. When the teacher on duty finally looked in their direction, the 3 girls immediately transformed their behavior, becoming animated and friendly, including Isabella in their conversation with exaggerated enthusiasm. The teacher smiled and turned away, satisfied that the children were playing nicely together. The moment the adult attention shifted, the harassment resumed. Cynthia felt sick watching this performance, recognizing it as a sophisticated form of psychological warfare that most adults never witnessed because it was designed to be invisible to them. These children had learned to weaponize their privilege, using their understanding of adult expectations to create perfect cover for their cruelty. But the worst part came when the lunch period ended. As the children lined up to go back inside, one of the girls whispered something to Isabella that made her face go completely white. Isabella's hand moved instinctively to her mother's necklace, and for a moment Cynthia thought the little girl might break down entirely. Instead, Isabella straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin with heartbreaking dignity, and walked into the building like nothing had happened. Cynthia spent the rest of the afternoon researching everything she could about the 3 girls she'd observed. Social media accounts, family information, school records, anything that might help her understand the dynamics at play. What she discovered was a pattern of behavior that had been carefully cultivated and protected by parents who viewed their children's social dominance as a reflection of their own success. Madison Pierce, the apparent ringleader, was the daughter of a prominent venture capitalist who served on the school's board of directors. Her Instagram account, managed by her parents, showcased a lifestyle of private jets, designer clothes, and exclusive events. The comments from her classmates revealed a social hierarchy where proximity to Madison determined a child's worth. The other two girls, Sophia Chen and Emma Rothschild, came from similarly powerful families. Tech executives, investment bankers, the kind of people who donated wings to buildings and had conference rooms named after them. Their children had learned early that power was something to be hoarded and wielded. And Isabella, despite her father's wealth, had somehow become their target. The research revealed something else troubling. Isabella wasn't Madison's first victim. There was a pattern going back years, a series of children who had transferred schools unexpectedly or whose parents had suddenly decided to relocate. The school's administration seemed to have developed a system of willful blindness, prioritizing the comfort of their most influential donors over the welfare of individual students. When Cynthia picked Isabella up from school that afternoon, she was prepared for what she might see, but the reality was still devastating. Isabella walked to the car with the same careful control she'd maintained all day, but the moment she closed the door and thought she was unobserved, her composure cracked. Her hands shook as she fastened her seatbelt, and Cynthia could see the effort it took for her to hold back tears. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Cynthia asked gently, keeping her tone light despite the fury building in her chest. "Fine," Isabella replied automatically. "I got 100% on my spelling test. That's wonderful. What about lunch? Did you eat with anyone special?" Isabella's pause stretched long enough to be meaningful. "I sat with Madison Pierce and her friends. They're very popular." The way she said it as if popularity was a weather condition she had to endure rather than something enjoyable, told Cynthia everything she needed to know about those lunchtime interactions. "They sound interesting," Cynthia said carefully. "What kinds of things do you talk about?" Another pause, and this time Cynthia caught Isabella's reflection in the passenger window. The little girl was biting her lip, a habit Cynthia was beginning to recognize as Isabella's way of keeping herself from saying too much. "They know a lot about fashion and parties," Isabella finally said. "They're teaching me about being more sophisticated." The euphemism was heartbreaking in its transparency. These children had learned to frame their cruelty as education, their harassment as friendship, their exclusion as inclusion. And Isabella, desperate for connection and approval, had internalized their narrative even while suffering under its reality. That evening, as Isabella completed her homework with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything else, Cynthia began developing a strategy. Direct confrontation would likely make things worse for Isabella, and going through official channels seemed unlikely to produce results given the families involved. Instead, she needed to document everything, build an irrefutable case, and find a way to empower Isabella to advocate for herself. But first, she needed Isabella to trust her enough to tell the truth. The breakthrough came during bedtime, when Isabella was finally tired enough for her defenses to slip. As Cynthia tucked her in, the little girl asked a question that revealed the depth of her confusion and pain. "Ms. Martinez, why do some people pretend to be your friend, but then hurt you when nobody's looking?" Cynthia's heart broke all over again, but she kept her voice steady. "Sometimes people hurt others because they're hurting inside themselves. But that doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't mean you deserve it." Isabella absorbed this for a moment, then asked the question that would change everything. What if the people hurting you are the ones everyone thinks are perfect? It was the opening Cynthia had been waiting for, but she knew she had to be careful not to push too hard too fast. "Even perfect-seeming people can do imperfect things," she said gently. And you know what? You never have to face those imperfect things alone. For the first time since Cynthia had arrived, Isabella looked directly at her with something approaching hope. Really? Really, Cynthia promised. Tomorrow we're going to start changing some things. Not everything at once, but little by little, we're going to make sure you feel safe and happy. Deal? Isabella nodded, and for the first time her smile looked genuine rather than performed. It was a small victory, but it was the beginning of something bigger. A partnership that would eventually expose the truth and transform not just Isabella's life, but the entire Henderson family's understanding of what really mattered. The next morning brought unexpected rain to San Francisco, drumming against the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows with an intensity that seemed to mirror Cynthia's growing determination. She found Isabella already dressed for school, but something was different. The little girl stood in front of her bedroom mirror, not checking her appearance with the usual mechanical precision, but staring at her reflection with the kind of contemplative sadness that belonged on someone decades older. The rain sounds angry, Isabella said, without turning around when Cynthia entered the room. Sometimes rain does sound angry, Cynthia agreed, joining Isabella at the window. But you know what I learned when I was about your age? Angry rain usually means something beautiful is coming afterward. Isabella finally turned to look at her, and Cynthia was struck by how much older the child seemed today. My mom used to say that storms wash away the dust so everything can sparkle again. It was the first time Isabella had shared something personal about her mother, without prompting, and Cynthia recognized it as a significant breakthrough. Your mom sounds like she was very wise. What else did she teach you about storms? For a moment, Isabella's carefully constructed walls wavered. She said that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you are scared. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I don't think I'm very brave. Cynthia knelt down, so she was at Isabella's eye level, her voice gentle but firm. Isabella, I've been watching you for 3 days now, and I think you're one of the bravest people I've ever met. Do you know why? Isabella shook her head, but there was curiosity in her dark eyes. Because every single day, you get up, you get dressed, you go to school, and you face whatever comes with dignity and grace. That takes incredible courage. The impact of these words was immediate and visible. Isabella's shoulders straightened slightly, and for a moment, Cynthia caught a glimpse of the confident child from the photographs with her mother. The breakfast routine proceeded as usual, but today Cynthia paid attention to different details. She noticed how Isabella arranged her food in specific patterns before eating, how she checked the time repeatedly, and how she seemed to steel herself before each transition from one part of the morning to the next. These weren't just habits, they were coping mechanisms, small rituals that helped Isabella maintain control in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. When Marcus called from his hotel in Seattle, Cynthia made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Instead of the usual brief handoff to Isabella, she requested a private conversation first. Mr. Henderson, I'd like to discuss Isabella's school experience with you when you return, she said, keeping her tone professional but serious. There are some concerns I'd like to address. Marcus's response was typical, distracted, focused on logistics rather than emotional nuance. If there are academic issues, Patricia can coordinate with her tutors. Isabella's grades have been exceptional, so I'm not sure what concerns you might have. It's not about academics, Cynthia said carefully. It's about Isabella's social and emotional well-being at school. There was a pause, and Cynthia could almost hear Marcus's mental gears shifting to a problem-solving mode that treated everything like a business challenge. If there are behavior problems, we can discuss adjusting her schedule or increasing supervision. The response revealed so much about how the Henderson family operated. Every challenge was viewed through the lens of optimization and control, rather than understanding and empathy. Mr. Henderson, I think Isabella would benefit from having you at pickup today. She's mentioned wanting to show you her classroom. It wasn't entirely true, but Cynthia needed Marcus to see his daughter's world firsthand. After some negotiation and schedule rearranging, Marcus agreed to cut his trip short and return for afternoon pickup. The day at school brought new revelations. Cynthia had positioned herself in the same coffee shop, but today she brought professional-grade binoculars and began documenting what she observed. With the thoroughness of someone building a legal case, the morning recess revealed the sophistication of the bullying campaign against Isabella. Madison Pierce and her followers had developed a system that was both psychologically devastating and nearly invisible to adult supervision. They would invite Isabella to join their games, then systematically exclude her once play began. They would compliment her appearance, then whisper comments designed to make her self-conscious. They would offer friendship, then withdraw it the moment Isabella began to trust. But today brought something new: physical escalation. During what appeared to be a game of tag, Madison deliberately tripped Isabella, sending her sprawling across the asphalt playground. The fall looked accidental to the supervising teacher, who simply helped Isabella up and told the girls to be more careful. But from her vantage point across the street, Cynthia could see Madison's satisfied smile and the way the other girls struggled to contain their laughter. Isabella's response broke Cynthia's heart all over again. She didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't even seem surprised. She simply brushed off her uniform, checked to make sure her mother's necklace was still secure, and returned to her carefully constructed composure. But Cynthia noticed the way Isabella favored her left wrist for the rest of recess, and how she kept touching a spot on her knee where her tights had torn. The lunch period brought psychological warfare that was even more sophisticated. The three girls surrounded Isabella at her usual isolated table, creating the appearance of inclusion while systematically destroying her self-esteem. Cynthia couldn't hear the words from across the street, but she could read the body language perfectly. Each comment caused Isabella to shrink a little more, to check her appearance, to touch her mother's necklace like a talisman against cruelty. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the girls, Cynthia thought it was Sophia Chen, reached out and deliberately knocked Isabella's lunch tray to the ground. The carefully packed meal scattered across the cafeteria floor, drawing attention from nearby tables. Isabella's face flushed with humiliation as she knelt to clean up the mess, while the three girls watched with expressions of mock concern. When a teacher approached to help, the girls immediately shifted into performance mode, expressing worry for Isabella's clumsiness and offering to help. The teacher, clearly overwhelmed by cafeteria supervision duties, accepted their explanation and moved on. Isabella finished cleaning alone, then spent the rest of lunch sitting at an empty table with no food, staring down at her hands with the defeated posture of someone who had finally reached their breaking point. Cynthia was already reaching for her phone to call the school when something remarkable happened. Isabella lifted her head, looked directly across the cafeteria at Madison Pierce, and smiled. Not the careful, placating smile she usually wore, but something different. A smile that carried knowledge and determination and the promise of change. It lasted only a moment before Isabella returned to her usual guarded expression. But Cynthia had seen it. Whatever internal process Isabella had been going through was reaching a conclusion. The little girl was done being a victim. The afternoon pickup brought Marcus Henderson into Isabella's world for the first time in months. Cynthia watched from her car as his black sedan pulled up to the school's circular drive, Marcus checking his phone even as he stepped out to wait for his daughter. When Isabella emerged from the building, Cynthia saw something she hadn't witnessed before: genuine joy on the little girl's face. The sight of her father, unexpected and wonderful, transformed Isabella momentarily back into the confident child from the photographs. She ran to him with uncharacteristic abandon, throwing her arms around his waist with an enthusiasm that clearly surprised him. But the transformation didn't last. Within moments, Isabella's natural wariness reasserted itself as she noticed other parents and children watching their reunion. She stepped back, smoothed her uniform, and returned to the careful composure that had become her armor. Marcus, for his part, seemed genuinely moved by his daughter's initial reaction, but equally uncertain about how to sustain the connection. Cynthia watched as he knelt to Isabella's level, really looking at her face for what appeared to be the first time in weeks. That's when he noticed the scraped knee, the way she favored her left wrist, and the careful way she moved that suggested soreness in her ribs. The businessman's analytical mind that served him so well in corporate negotiations suddenly focused on his daughter with laser-like intensity. "Isabella, what happened to your knee?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying concern that seemed to surprise both of them. Isabella's response was immediate and practiced. "I'm just clumsy, Daddy. I fell during recess." But Marcus was looking more closely now, and Cynthia could see him beginning to notice things that had been invisible when viewed through the lens of busy schedules and delegated responsibilities. The way Isabella held herself, the careful modulation of her voice, the protective way she touched her mother's necklace when discussing anything that might be controversial. "How often do you fall at recess?" Marcus asked gently. The question seemed to catch Isabella off guard. In a household where efficiency and performance were prized above emotional expression, having someone inquire about the frequency of her injuries was unprecedented. "I don't know," she said uncertainly. "Sometimes." Marcus looked around the pickup area, taking in the social dynamics he'd never bothered to observe before. He watched as other children greeted their parents with easy confidence, chattering about their day with the natural enthusiasm of kids who felt secure in their world. The contrast with Isabella's careful, measured behavior was stark and troubling. "Isabella," Marcus said, and there was something different in his voice, softer, more present. "Are you happy at school?" It was perhaps the most important question he'd ever asked his daughter, and Isabella's response would change everything. She looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to carry far too much knowledge for someone her age, and for a moment Cynthia thought she might tell him the truth. But then Isabella's gaze shifted to the other children and parents around them, to the world where admitting unhappiness or vulnerability could be weaponized against her. And she made the choice that had protected her so far. "Yes, Daddy," she said with a smile that was both heartbreaking and convincing. "I'm very happy." But Marcus was learning to read his daughter's expressions, and what he saw in her eyes didn't match her words. As they drove home together, Cynthia following behind in her own car, she could see through the rear window that Marcus was asking more questions, and Isabella was providing more carefully crafted answers. By the time they reached the mansion, something fundamental had shifted in Marcus Henderson. For the first time since Elena's death, he was truly seeing his daughter, not as a responsibility to be managed or a reflection of his own success, but as a vulnerable little girl who needed protection and understanding. The conversation that would follow would shatter every assumption the Henderson family had built about their carefully controlled world, and set in motion events that would transform not just Isabella's life, but her father's understanding of what it meant to truly love and protect his child. The Henderson mansion felt different that evening, charged with an undercurrent of change that both Marcus and Isabella seemed to sense, but neither quite understood. Cynthia watched as father and daughter navigated their first real conversation in months, both of them moving carefully around truths that felt too dangerous to speak. Aloud over dinner, Marcus's first family meal at home in weeks, he asked questions that revealed how little he knew about his daughter's daily reality. Simple inquiries about her favorite subjects, her lunch preferences, her thoughts about her teachers were met with responses that sounded like carefully prepared speeches rather than natural conversation. "Isabella seems very articulate," Marcus said to Cynthia later that evening, after Isabella had gone to bed, following her usual elaborate bedtime routine. "She's learned to be very careful with her words," Cynthia replied diplomatically. "That's not always the same thing as being comfortable expressing herself." Marcus absorbed this, and Cynthia could see him beginning to understand that his daughter's exceptional behavior might be more concerning than comforting. Patricia mentioned that Isabella's previous nannies had concerns about her social development. I assumed they simply didn't understand our emphasis on academic achievement. The admission revealed how the Henderson family had constructed narratives to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. Every warning sign had been reframed as evidence of Isabella's exceptional focus. Every concern dismissed as misunderstanding of their high standards. "Mr. Henderson," Cynthia said carefully, "what would you say if I told you that Isabella might be experiencing some challenges at school that go beyond academics?" Marcus's response was immediate and defensive. "Marin Academy is one of the finest schools in the state. We specifically chose it for its academic rigor and the caliber of families it attracts. Sometimes the most privileged environments can create their own unique pressures," Cynthia said. "Isabella is incredibly bright and well-behaved, but I think she's also carrying some burdens that are too heavy for an 8-year-old. Before Marcus could respond, they were interrupted by a sound from upstairs, Isabella crying out in what sounded like distress. Both adults rushed toward her bedroom, finding Isabella sitting up in bed, trembling and disoriented from what appeared to be a nightmare. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Marcus asked, sitting on the edge of her bed with an awkwardness that suggested this wasn't a familiar role for him. Isabella's response revealed more than any conversation could have. "I was dreaming about school," she whispered, unconsciously touching the spot on her ribs that Cynthia knew was tender. "Madison said she was going to tell everyone about my mom's necklace." The comment hung in the air like a confession, and Cynthia saw Marcus's expression shift from concern to confusion to something approaching alarm. "What about your mother's necklace, sweetheart?" Isabella's face went pale as she realized what she'd revealed. Her eyes darted to Cynthia, seeking guidance about whether it was safe to continue, and in that moment, Marcus finally understood that his daughter was living in fear. "Isabella," he said gently, "you can tell me anything. No matter what it is, we'll figure it out together." What followed was the conversation that would change everything. Haltingly, with frequent pauses to gauge her father's reaction, Isabella began to tell the truth about her school experience. She spoke about Madison Pierce and her friends, about the daily humiliations disguised as friendship, about the careful choreography of cruelty that adult eyes never seemed to catch. "They said my mom's necklace was ugly," Isabella whispered, her small hand clutching the silver pendant. "Madison said only poor people wear cheap jewelry, and that my daddy must not really love me if he lets me wear something so embarrassing." Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then a fury so intense that Cynthia worried he might frighten Isabella. But when he spoke, his voice was controlled and gentle. "Isabella, that necklace belonged to your mother, and it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen because she wore it. Anyone who would say otherwise is wrong and cruel, and not someone whose opinion matters." The validation seemed to unlock something in Isabella, and the stories began flowing, weeks of accumulated humiliation, casual cruelty, and systematic isolation. She told them about lunch trays knocked to the floor, about games that were designed to make her fail, about whispered comments that made her question everything about herself. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Marcus asked, and Cynthia heard the anguish in his voice. Isabella's answer was devastating in its simplicity. "I didn't want to disappoint you. You always say I should handle things myself and not cause problems for other people." The comment hit Marcus like a physical blow, and Cynthia saw him realize how his emphasis on self-sufficiency and high achievement had inadvertently taught his daughter that asking for help was a form of failure. But the conversation was far from over. As Isabella grew more comfortable sharing her experiences, the true scope of the problem became clear. This wasn't occasional teasing or typical childhood conflicts. This was systematic psychological warfare conducted by children who had learned to weaponize their privilege and social status. "They have a group chat," Isabella said quietly. "Madison showed me some of the messages. They write things about kids they don't like and share pictures to make fun of them." Cynthia and Marcus exchanged glances, both recognizing the serious implications of cyberbullying among elementary school children. This was territory that required immediate intervention, but also careful navigation to avoid making things worse for Isabella. "Do they have pictures of you?" Cynthia asked gently. Isabella nodded, tears starting to flow freely for the first time since Cynthia had known her. "Madison took a picture when I fell yesterday. She said she was going to make it into a meme and share it with everyone." The technological aspect of the bullying added layers of complexity that Marcus's generation hadn't faced as children. These weren't just playground conflicts that ended when school was over. They followed Isabella home through social media, text messages, and the constant anxiety of not knowing when the next humiliation would be shared with her peers. "And the teachers don't see any of this?" Marcus asked, his business mind already working on solutions and accountability. "Madison's really smart about it," Isabella explained with the weary wisdom of someone twice her age. "She only does mean things when adults aren't looking. And when teachers are around, she acts really nice to me, so if I ever complained, it would look like I was making things up." The sophistication of the psychological manipulation was staggering. These 8-year-olds had learned to gaslight their victims, to create plausible deniability for their actions, and to manipulate adult perceptions with startling effectiveness. As the full picture emerged, Marcus's fury began to give way to something more complex, a profound grief for the childhood his daughter had lost, guilt over his own failures to protect her, and a determination to make things right that was unlike anything Cynthia had seen in her years of working with high-powered families. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to the school," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the authority that had built his business empire. "This ends now," but Isabella's reaction surprised both adults. "Daddy, no," she said, with more emotion than she'd shown about anything else. "If you complain about them, they'll just get better at hiding it, and then it will be worse." The comment revealed how thoroughly the bullying had affected Isabella's thinking. She'd been conditioned to believe that seeking help would only escalate her suffering, that adult intervention was more likely to backfire than provide relief. "Isabella," Cynthia said carefully, "what if we could find a way to handle this that didn't make things worse for you? What if we could document what's happening so clearly that the school would have to take action?" For the first time in the conversation, Isabella looked hopeful. How would we do that? What followed was the beginning of a plan that would require courage from all three of them. Marcus would need to set aside his instinct for immediate, direct confrontation in favor of a more strategic approach. Isabella would need to find the strength to advocate for herself with adult support rather than suffering in silence. And Cynthia would need to use all of her experience and intuition to create conditions where the truth could emerge safely. But first, they had to get through the next day at school, armed with knowledge, but not yet with solutions. Isabella went back to sleep that night in her father's arms. The first time in years that Marcus had provided that kind of comfort, but all three of them understood that the real challenges lay ahead. The bullying situation had been exposed, but exposure was just the first step. The next phase would require them to navigate the complex social and institutional dynamics that had allowed the abuse to flourish, while protecting Isabella from retaliation and ensuring that other children didn't suffer the same fate. As Cynthia prepared for bed in her own room that night, she reviewed everything Isabella had shared, looking for patterns and vulnerabilities that could be used to build a case against the bullies and their enablers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had brought something more valuable: truth, trust, and the beginning of a family learning how to protect each other. The foundation had been laid for the confrontation that was coming, one that would test everyone's courage and reveal the true character of the adults responsible for keeping children safe. The morning after Isabella's revelation brought a transformation in the Henderson household that was both subtle and profound. Marcus had called his office to cancel all meetings for the day, something his assistant later described as unprecedented in 5 years of working for him. Instead of his usual rushed breakfast routine, he sat with Isabella as she ate, really watching her for signs of distress he'd been too distracted to notice before. Cynthia observed this new dynamic with cautious optimism. Overnight, Marcus had evolved from a well-meaning but absent father into someone who was beginning to understand that true protection required presence, not just provision. But she also knew that good intentions weren't enough to dismantle a sophisticated bullying network that had been operating with impunity for months. "Isabella," Marcus said gently, as they prepared for what would be a crucial day at school, "I want you to know that everything we discussed last night stays between us until we figure out the best way to handle it. You're not going to face this alone anymore." Isabella nodded, but Cynthia could see the wariness in her expression. Years of disappointment had taught her not to trust promises too quickly, even from her father. "What if nothing changes?" she asked quietly. "Then we'll try something else," Marcus replied with a conviction that surprised even him. "And if that doesn't work, we'll try again. We'll keep trying until you feel safe and happy at school." The commitment was more than words. It was a fundamental shift in priorities that would reshape how Marcus approached his responsibilities as a father. But Isabella's response revealed how much damage had already been done to her trust in adult protection. "Madison's daddy sits on the school board," Isabella said matter-of-factly. "And Sophia's mom donated the new library. Emma's family has their name on the gymnasium. What if the grown-ups at school think they're more important than me?" The question demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics that no 8-year-old should possess. Isabella had learned to navigate a world where influence and wealth determined whose voices mattered, and she'd correctly identified her own vulnerable position in that hierarchy. Marcus looked stricken by his daughter's political awareness, but Cynthia saw an opportunity. "Isabella, what if we could show the school exactly what's been happening without anyone being able to ignore it or explain it away?" For the first time in days, Isabella showed genuine interest. How would we do that? Cynthia had spent most of the night developing a plan that would require courage from Isabella, but would also provide her with agency in addressing her own situation. What if we could record some of what happens during lunch and recess? Not to get anyone in trouble right away, but to have proof that adults can't dismiss. The idea of gathering evidence appealed to Isabella's methodical mind. After months of feeling powerless, the possibility of taking action, even covert action, seemed to energize her in a way nothing else had. "My phone has a voice recorder," she said thoughtfully. "And it's small enough to hide in my pocket." Marcus started to object, worried about the risks of Isabella being caught documenting harassment, but Cynthia had anticipated his concerns. "We'll be strategic about it. Isabella will only record when she feels safe doing so, and we'll teach her how to gather evidence without putting herself in more danger." Over the next hour, they developed what Marcus later described as the most important strategic plan of his career. Isabella would attend school as usual, but with several key differences. She would carry a small recording device in her uniform pocket. She would document incidents in a notebook immediately after they occurred, while details were fresh. And most importantly, she would have a code word she could text to both Cynthia and Marcus if she needed immediate intervention. But the plan went beyond mere documentation. Cynthia had researched Marin Academy's policies and discovered several procedural violations in how they'd handled previous bullying reports. The school's own handbook required specific response protocols that had been consistently ignored when dealing with complaints about influential students. Were going to hold them accountable to their own standards, Cynthia explained to Marcus as they drove to the school together, following Isabella's bus from a discreet distance. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against institutional bias is their own written policies. The day began with Cynthia positioning herself in the now familiar coffee shop, but today she wasn't alone. Marcus sat beside her, experiencing his daughter's school environment through the eyes of someone who was finally paying attention. What he saw during the morning recess shattered his remaining illusions about Marin Academy's protective environment. "My God," he whispered, as they watched Madison Pierce and her friends surround Isabella near the playground equipment. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on what Isabella's told us, at least since the beginning of the school year," Cynthia replied. "But I suspect it started earlier and just escalated over time." Through binoculars, they watched as the three girls engaged in their usual psychological warfare. The sophistication of their cruelty was even more apparent when viewed with full knowledge of what was happening. Every gesture that looked friendly to distant observers was actually calculated to humiliate or intimidate. Every laugh was at Isabella's expense. Every moment of apparent inclusion was designed to make the subsequent exclusion more painful. But today, something was different. Isabella wasn't just enduring the harassment, she was documenting it. Her small hand moved to her pocket several times, activating the recording device when conversations began. She positioned herself to capture not just words, but context, timing, and the presence or absence of adult supervision. Marcus watched his daughter navigate this psychological minefield with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. "She's so brave," he said quietly. "I never realized how brave she's had to be just to get through each day." The lunch period brought the kind of incident that would change everything. Madison Pierce, perhaps sensing that Isabella was somehow different today, escalated her tactics beyond anything they'd previously observed. She approached Isabella's lunch table with an expression of exaggerated concern. "Isabella, I've been thinking about what we discussed yesterday," Madison said, her voice carrying the false sweetness that made Cynthia's skin crawl. "About your mom's necklace?" Even from across the street, they could see Isabella's hand move instinctively to the silver pendant. "What about it?" Isabella asked, her voice barely audible but clearly captured by the recording device in her pocket. "Well, my mum and I were talking, and we think it would be better if you didn't wear it to school anymore. Some of the other kids have been saying mean things about it, and we don't want anyone to hurt your feelings." The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Madison was framing her harassment as protection, making Isabella's most treasured possession, the last tangible connection to her deceased mother, seem like a source of shame and vulnerability. But Isabella's response revealed how much she'd changed overnight. Instead of the usual cowering acceptance, she looked directly at Madison and said, "My mom's necklace is beautiful, and I'm going to wear it every day for the rest of my life. If that makes some people uncomfortable, that's their problem, not mine." The transformation was visible even from across the street. Isabella sat straighter, spoke more clearly, and for the first time in months looked like the confident child from the photographs with her mother. Madison's reaction was immediate and revealing. Faced with unexpected resistance from someone she'd grown accustomed to dominating, she dropped her facade of concern and revealed the underlying cruelty. "Fine," Madison snapped, "but don't come crying to us when everyone thinks you're a weird loser who's obsessed with dead people." The comment was so shocking in its callousness that even Sophia and Emma looked uncomfortable. But Isabella's response was even more remarkable than her initial resistance. "Madison," she said calmly, "my mom taught me that people who say cruel things about other people are usually just showing everyone how unhappy they are inside. I feel sorry for you." The psychological reversal was complete. In a matter of moments, Isabella had transformed from victim to someone who could see through her tormentor's tactics and respond with both strength and compassion. Marcus gripped Cynthia's arm as they watched this exchange. Did Isabella just stand up to them?" "She did more than that," Cynthia replied with satisfaction. "She just documented a clear case of harassment while demonstrating that she's not going to be intimidated anymore." The recording device had captured everything: Madison's manipulative approach, her cruel escalation when met with resistance, and Isabella's mature, composed responses. But more importantly, it had captured Isabella's transformation from victim to survivor. The afternoon brought additional documentation as Madison and her friends, frustrated by Isabella's new resistance, made increasingly desperate attempts to reassert their dominance. Each incident was recorded, noted, and witnessed by Isabella with the methodical precision she'd learned from her father's business practices. By the time school ended, they had gathered enough evidence to build an irrefutable case. But more importantly, they had witnessed Isabella's evolution into someone who could advocate for herself while maintaining her dignity and compassion. That evening, as they reviewed the day's recordings and planned their next steps, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. "I'm proud of you," he told Isabella, pulling her close in a way that felt natural for the first time since Elena's death. Not just for being brave today, but for being the kind of person who can stand up for herself without becoming cruel to others. Isabella's smile was genuine and radiant. "Mom always said that the best way to stop bullies is to not let them make you become like them." As they prepared for the confrontation that would come tomorrow, all three of them understood that the real victory had already been won. Isabella had found her voice, Marcus had found his priorities, and together they had found a way to transform a situation of powerlessness into one of empowerment. The evidence they'd gathered would be important, but the transformation of the Henderson family was priceless. The next morning arrived with crystalline clarity, as if the San Francisco fog had finally lifted to reveal truths that had been hidden too long. Marcus Henderson walked into Marin Academy's administrative offices carrying a leather portfolio that contained not just evidence of systematic bullying, but documentation of institutional failure that would reshape how the school handled student welfare. Principal Victoria Ashworth, a woman whose career had been built on managing the delicate politics of educating the children of Silicon Valley's elite, greeted Marcus with the polished professionalism she reserved for the school's most influential donors. Her expression shifted dramatically when Marcus placed the first audio recording on her desk. "Mr. Henderson, I'm sure we can resolve whatever concerns you have through our standard—" "Mrs. Ashworth," Marcus interrupted, with the controlled intensity that had made him legendary in boardrooms. "I need you to listen to this recording in its entirety before you say another word." The audio quality was remarkably clear. Isabella's small recording device had captured not just words, but tone, context, and the calculated cruelty of children who had learned to weaponize their privilege. As Madison Pierce's voice filled the office, delivering psychological torture with the casual efficiency of someone who had perfected her technique. Principal Ashworth's face went pale, but Marcus was just getting started. He produced a second recording, then a third, each one documenting a different aspect of the harassment campaign that had been conducted under the school's supervision. The evidence was systematic, comprehensive, and utterly damning. "This has been happening for months," Marcus said quietly. "My 8-year-old daughter has been enduring psychological abuse while your staff has been looking the other way." Principal Ashworth's attempts at damage control revealed everything Marcus needed to know about the school's priorities. "Mr. Henderson, I'm sure this sounds worse than it actually is. Children can be dramatic, and sometimes normal social interactions are misinterpreted. Would you like to hear the recording where Madison Pierce mocked my deceased wife?" Marcus asked with deadly calm. "Or perhaps the one where she deliberately destroyed Isabella's lunch while your cafeteria supervisor stood 10 feet away?" The room fell silent, except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning system. Principal Ashworth was beginning to understand that this wasn't a concerned parent she could placate with vague promises and diplomatic language. This was a man with the resources and determination to hold her institution accountable for its failures. But Marcus had saved the most devastating evidence for last. He opened his laptop and began playing a video that Cynthia had filmed from across the street clear footage of Madison Pierce physically assaulting Isabella while a teacher looked on and did nothing. This is assault. Mrs. Ashworth, committed by one of your students against another under the supervision of your staff. On your campus, the legal implications hung in the air like a storm cloud. Principal Ashworth was an administrator, but she was also a realist who understood that the Henderson family's resources made this a threat that could destroy careers and institutions. "What do you want, Mr. Henderson?" she asked finally, abandoning pretense for direct negotiation. Marcus's response revealed how much he'd learned about true leadership in the past week. "I want systematic changes that will protect every child in this school, not just my daughter. I want Madison Pierce and her accomplices held accountable according to your own disciplinary policies. And I want guarantees that this kind of institutional negligence will never happen again." The transformation of Marcus Henderson from absent father to fierce protector was complete. But his demands went beyond personal vengeance. He'd learned that Isabella's suffering was part of a larger pattern of privileged children being allowed to abuse their peers with impunity. Principal Ashworth's attempts to negotiate revealed the depth of the problem. Madison Pierce's father sat on the board of directors. Sophia Chen's family had donated the new science wing. Emma Rothschild's parents were major annual donors. The school had created a system where accountability was inversely proportional to family wealth and influence. "Mr. Henderson, you have to understand the delicate nature of our community. These are good families dealing with complex social dynamics. These are children who have been taught that their money gives them the right to torture other children," Marcus replied with finality. "And this institution has enabled that belief. That ends today." What followed was a negotiation that would have made Marcus's corporate lawyers proud. Within 2 hours, he had secured written agreements for policy changes, mandatory anti-bullying training for all staff, and specific consequences for the students who had targeted Isabella. But the real victory came when Isabella herself walked into the principal's office for a face-to-face meeting with Madison Pierce and her parents. Cynthia had prepared Isabella for this moment, teaching her how to articulate her experience with dignity and strength. Madison Pierce, confronted with irrefutable evidence of her behavior and stripped of her usual audience of enablers, looked like what she actually was, a troubled child who had learned to mask her own insecurities through cruelty toward others. "Madison," Isabella said with remarkable composure, "I want you to know that I forgive you for what you did to me. But I also want you to understand that what you did was wrong, and it hurt me very much." The response from Madison was unexpected. Faced with genuine compassion from someone she had tormented, the 8-year-old bully began to cry, not the manipulative tears she'd used to escape consequences before, but genuine remorse from a child who was finally seeing the impact of her actions. "I'm sorry, Isabella," Madison whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt you so much. I was angry about other things, and I took it out on you." The moment of genuine connection between the two girls revealed something that all the adults in the room needed to understand. Children who bully are often struggling with their own pain and insecurity. Madison's cruelty toward Isabella had been a misdirection of her own emotional turmoil. Isabella's response showed the emotional intelligence that would serve her well throughout her life. "Madison, being angry about other things doesn't make it okay to hurt people. But if you want to be friends for real, not pretend friends, I would like that." The transformation was visible in both girls. Madison, stripped of her protective cruelty, looked vulnerable and young. Isabella, empowered by her own courage and her father's support, looked confident and mature. The resolution that followed wasn't perfect, but it was real. Madison Pierce was suspended for a week and required to undergo counseling. Sophia Chen and Emma Rothschild faced similar consequences. The school implemented new supervision protocols for lunch and recess. Staff received mandatory training on recognizing and addressing bullying. But the most important change was in the Henderson family itself. Marcus had discovered that true success wasn't measured in stock prices or market share, but in the security and happiness of the people he loved. Isabella had learned that she possessed inner strength she hadn't known existed, and that asking for help was a sign of wisdom, not weakness. 6 months later, the transformation was complete and lasting. Isabella thrived at school, not just academically but socially. She had developed genuine friendships with classmates who appreciated her kindness and intelligence. Madison Pierce, after months of counseling, had become one of those friends. Their shared experience of vulnerability had created an unexpected bond. Marcus had restructured his entire life around being present for Isabella. He attended her school events, helped with homework, and made sure she knew every day that she was loved and valued. The business empire he'd built didn't suffer from his increased focus on family. If anything, his employees and partners respected the man who had learned to balance success with love. Cynthia remained with the Henderson family, but her role had evolved from nanny to trusted family friend and advocate. She had taught them all invaluable lessons about courage, compassion, and the importance of fighting for what matters most. The evening that would stay with Marcus forever came 6 months after the confrontation at school. Isabella was showing him a story she'd written for English class, a tale about a little girl who learned to stand up to bullies with the help of her father and a wise woman who became like family. "Daddy," Isabella said as they sat together in the garden where she used to play with her mother, "do you think Mommy would be proud of how we handled everything?" Marcus looked at his daughter, confident, happy, and secure in the knowledge that she was loved, and felt tears well up in his eyes for the first time since Elena's funeral. "Isabella," he said, pulling her close, "your mother would be incredibly proud of both of us. But mostly, she'd be proud of the amazing, brave, compassionate person you've become." As the sun set over San Francisco Bay, the Henderson mansion felt like what it had always been meant to be. Not a showcase of wealth and success, but a home filled with love, understanding, and the unbreakable bond between a father and daughter who had learned to protect each other. The little girl who had once eaten breakfast alone at a table for 12 now, shared every meal with people who cherished her. The absent father, who had once measured his love in expensive gifts, now understood that presence was the most valuable thing he could offer. And the nanny, who had arrived to do a job, had become part of a family that proved love could triumph over any challenge. Their story became a testament to the power of courage, the importance of standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, and the transformative magic that happens when people choose connection over convenience, love over legacy, and family over everything else. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.